Good morning. Today's date is June 12th, 2007. My name is Richard Nicholas. Today I'll be conducting an oral history interview with Clement Ferris for the Veterans History Project in partnership with the Dalton Council on Aging. This interview is being held at the Dalton Community Television Studio in Dalton, Massachusetts. Good morning, Clement.
Good morning, Vic.
Could you please state your full name and would you spell your last name?
My name is Clement A. Anthony Ferris, Ferris.
And where do you presently live?
In Pittsfield, Massachusetts.
And could you tell us your date of birth and where you were born?
I was born in Pittsfield on 11/23/24.
And did you grow up and go to school in Pittsfield?
I did.
That was during the Depression, Clem. Can you tell us what life was like growing up in Pittsfield at that time?
Yes. No one had any money. As a kid growing up, you'd cut lawns, grass, people's grass. You'd peddle papers and magazines. And everybody seemed to have a great rapport amongst themselves between the people, even though there was no employment, no work, or what have you. They were good times.
Did you have any brothers and sisters?
I did. I had 4 brothers and 1 sister.
And I understand one of your brothers was in the service.
Yes, my oldest brother, George, was in the Air Force.
And you had another brother, Jim, who worked at the GE?
Yes, and he was just about a year older than I was, and he was in the apprentice program at GE at the time, but he lost an eye. And as a result of that, he was unable to go into the service.
But at some point, the draft board decided he was fit. Is that correct?
At some time, they did say that Jim, although he had been exempt because of that injury, he was nevertheless going to be drafted. And my mother, like most mothers, wrote a letter to President Truman. And Truman wrote back and said he will not be taken as a draftee.
What a treasure that letter would be.
I wish we had it.
What did your father do for a living, Clem?
Well, my father, when he was younger, had a tobacco farm with my grandfather in Southwick, Massachusetts. And then when he and my mother got married, they got married. She was from Dalton, my mother was. And he worked in the GE and stayed there for many, many years and retired from there.
And you told me his pay during the Depression was?
$12 a week.
Was he a veteran?
Yes, he was, U.S. Army.
In World War I?
Yes.
Now, did you graduate from high school?
I did, St. Joseph High School in 1942.
And you told me earlier about a baseball story where you tried out for the baseball team.
Oh, yes, Joe Wachowski, who was a great football player and on the, what they call them, the 7 blocks of granite for Fordham. He was the punter. He was our coach. And I always wanted to be a baseball pitcher. And so one day he gave me a tryout. And my friend Billy Larkin, who used to run Fahey Beverage in Pittsfield, came up to bat. And the first pitch I threw went right for Bill's head, and I hollered to him to duck. But all he did was turn his head, and it caught him right behind the ear. And he went to the ground, and I ran over to him. And Wachowski said, "Ferris, get the hell off the mound."
That was the end of that
That
career.
was the end of my baseball career.
What did you do after high school, Clem?
Well, I went down to a place called Catonsville, Maryland, because a friend of mine, Jack Riley, of the Riley family in Pittsfield, in which there were several priests, thought I should try to become a priest. Well, I tried it, but I didn't really feel inclined that way, and I resigned and came back to Pittsfield and volunteered for the U.S. Marines.
This was St. Charles College down there?
Yes.
And you signed up for the Marines. Why did you choose the Marine Corps?
Well, I had read quite a bit about them, but I always understood that the Marines gave you the best training, and I agree that I think that's a fact. And that was my primary reason for joining the Marines.
And do you remember your dates of service?
April of 43 to May of 46,
And where did they send you for boot camp?
Parris Island,
And how old were you at this time?
18.
Now, can you describe your first impressions of Parris Island?
It was a nightmare. One of the things that when you got off the train in a place called Yamasee, they loaded us onto cattle trucks, and all you could hear from the moment you got onto the trucks, in addition to very abusive language by the drill instructors and what have you, as you rode into Parris Island, was the call, "You'll be sorry." And that was a perennial introduction that any Marine got when they went to Parris Island.
You know, off camera you described an incident with me where you were marching behind a guy that couldn't march very well, and you made a comment to him.
Oh yes, there was, in boot camp you do a lot of marching along with other training periods. And on this one occasion there was a fella, and I think he was from New Jersey. He was a step ahead of me in the drill, and he was kind of a lumbering, I'm going to call him an ox. So I said to him, "Get in step," because he couldn't seem to keep the step going. He said, "I'll see you after and I'll show you how I can march." Well, after the session was over with, our drill instructor, a fellow named Corporal Peterson, said, "We're going to have some boxing." So he said to this particular fella, "You're going to be a boxer." And he called out to a fellow named Archambault, Leonard Archambault, who I think was from Dalton at the time, and later lived in Pittsfield after the war was over. And Lenny and I became lifelong friends as a result of meeting there. But Archambault was chosen to put the gloves on with this fellow, and although he couldn't march, he could box like hell, and he beat the hell out of poor old Archie.
Do you remember your drill instructors?
Yes, I do. Corporal Peterson. One of the things I remember, he was a great guy. He was a meticulous leader and drill instructor. And when we had finished our program, without coming right out, they organized a going away gift for him. That was another standard practice in the Marine Corps. We didn't have much money at the time, so everybody probably chipped in 50 cents or a buck.
And he arranged his own
own farewell party.
Now, you had a major on the rifle range.
Major Moe.
Who was a pretty good guy.
Yes, he was a good fella.
And you mentioned the party he gave you after you completed that firing.
Yes, they marched. They made us all fall in. They marched us out to the beach in South Carolina, which was right next to the rifle range. And there they gave you all the beer you could drink. And as you can imagine, it was a success.
Now this was new to you. Was it hard for you to adjust to military life?
No, I enjoyed it actually. There were periods when it was kind of tough, or you might run into some obstacle, but I enjoyed it generally. The food was good. Discipline was tough, but you could see the purpose of it.
And how long was boot camp? Excuse me. How long was boot camp?
I'm going to guess 8 to 12 weeks.
Did you get a leave after boot camp?
Yes, I think I had I'm not sure how long it was, but maybe a 10-day, 15-day furlough.
Mm-hmm. Did you get to come back to Pittsfield?
I did.
And where'd you go after your leave?
I went back to Parris Island because I had been chosen to be one of the rifle range instructors. I might mention that while in boot camp, they tested every one of us to see what our inclinations were as either by choice or by ability. Some people were taken to radio school or became clerks, typists, and what have you, or went into the MPs or did some other work, became a rifle range instructor or a drill instructor.
And you shot expert with the rifles, that's right?
I did, yes.
So you were chosen to go back and become an instructor?
Yes.
And who was in charge of the rifle range when you went back?
There's Major Moe.
And you worked under a lieutenant too?
There was a Lieutenant Moore who was an expert with small arms like the .38 pistol or revolver and the .45 pistol, the .22, the Rising submachine gun, and the Thompson submachine gun. And he was always setting up, in addition to the instructions, competition between the participants.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned one time where you were getting a good group on a target when you were firing competition, and the lieutenant told you to leave it alone, and you wanted to change the windage.
Oh yes, when I went from the rifle range at Paris Island, I moved up to Cherry Point for further rifle range duties. But before I left Paris Island, I had to requalify. So in the process of requalifying, I went through the same course that the recruits were going through, and I had a coach, just like myself, advising me on what I should do for the shooting of the course. In the experience that I had at that particular time, I found that on one day I had moved all of the 16 shots, I think on the kneeling position, up to the right-hand corner of the target, out of the bullseye. And I said to the coach, I've got to move this windage to the left so that I'm going to put it back in the bullseye. He said, oh no, he said, leave it alone. He said, you already put all the shots in the bullseye in the sitting position. So I said, okay, maybe he could see things that I couldn't. Well, I didn't move it. I put the same shots up in the same area, which spoiled my record. So this particular coach went over to the chief warrant officer and explained what happened. The warrant officer said, reshoot it, which I did. And of course, I qualified again as an expert just prior to going up to Cherry Point.
Now, you mentioned off camera that all of the instructors were experts. You said some of them could fire all positions offhand.
At the rifle range, all of the instructors, including the lowest one on the range itself, up to the administrative people, were all expert small arms people. And we had, for instance, a group at Paris Island who would compete with Marines at Camp Lejeune or Camp Pendleton or what have you, or the Army. And what they would do is get this group. These were the old timers, and they would shoot 1,000 yards, 1,200 yards. Some of them were so big and heavy that they had to dig a hole at on the ground at the target in order to fit their belly into it. But they had expert riflemen, expert small arms people. And that was the specialty that they
and
were.
by offhand, that's shooting from the shoulder, right?
Offhand, we had people there that would shoot the entire course. It was 68 rounds, which you'd get 5 for each bullseye and 4 or 3 or 2 or a miss. You'd the course was a 68-shot course. Some of these warrant officers could shoot that entire course offhand. That means standing up, holding the rifle in a certain way, and they'd shoot expert.
That's amazing.
They were amazing.
Do you recall any incidents involving recruits you were training? You mentioned the policeman from New York.
Oh, I remember that as a coach, the drill instructors would bring their recruits up to the rifle range, and they would line up behind each target area, and they had benches for them. And then you would call a particular recruit up and start trying to tell him how to handle himself and his rifle and what have you, and elevation and windage at the different distances from the target. And there was one policeman there, a former policeman from New York City, and you get friendly with these people because you talk to them and find out a little bit about them. And he said, I want you to qualify me as an expert, because he said, back home, he said, I've got to go back and tell him I'm an expert Marine rifleman. Well, the best I could do, I couldn't get him qualified. He couldn't hit, as they say, a bull. But we remained friends, and we had a lot of officers training. Recruits came through, a lot of them from California. Wonderful officers, material, great guys. And I would say I had a very enjoyable experience all through this time. I remember one incident while I was on guard duty at that rifle range that an officer came down and told me to pick up my rising submachine gun and bring ammunition. And we got in a Jeep and went down to one of the target areas, and he said to this individual, "Are you, say, Private so-and-so?" And the fellow said, "Yes." He said, "You're under arrest. Get in the Jeep." And they took us right to the sick bay, what we call the sick bay, which was the hospital, and put him in confinement because he had a disease that he had contracted off base, and he didn't want the treatment, but he got it anyway.
He got it anyway. You told another interesting story during a lunch break on the range where they used to bring your food out to you.
At South Carolina, in the wintertime, it gets very cold, and you'd go out there in long underwear and sheepskin and what have you, but someone had the brilliant idea of bringing our food out to us on the range in these big containers, and we were instructed to bring our mess kits with us. And when it came time for chow, everything would shut down and we'd line up and get our food. Well, one of the coaches saw an opportunity to have some fun, so he took some bread. And just before we moved back, I think it was either to 300 or the 500 yards from the 200-yard line, he left the bread out in the open. And there were seagulls around there, and they started to circle looking for the bread. And this coach said to his trainee, "You see that seagull?" And the kid says, "Yeah." He said, "Get him." So he said, from then on, you could see about 10 different rifle bullets plowing up dirt where that seagull was. I don't think anybody got him, but
Little break in the action
until the firing officer said, "Cease fire! Stop the nonsense!"
Now, did you meet anyone else from Pittsfield that came through boot camp while you were there? You mentioned Jack Grady.
Oh, yes. There was a policeman in Pittsfield, I think he's still alive, named Dan Grady. His older brother Jack was a great football player in Pittsfield, about 1940, 41. And Grady's father was the superintendent of the communications systems there on Tyler Street in Pittsfield, worked for the city. And Jack had been to Providence College, I believe it was, and as a result of that was in the OCS, which was the officers training, coming through Paris Island for all of the training that every Marine gets. And I met him there and we talked, and he said, "You know, Clem," he said, "I'm not sure I can stand the training that we get here, that officers are way up on a pedestal and everybody else is below that." I said, "Jack, what difference does it make? Get your bar, you'll be a lot better off wherever you go in the service." Well, he said he wasn't too happy about it. At that particular time, his younger brother Dan was in the action in one of the battles, and his father was very concerned about the safety of Dan. In the meantime, Jack quit the Marines, was drafted into the Army, was sent to Europe and got killed. And it was a tragedy. It killed the father, but that was another fellow I met, was Jack Grady, great fellow.
Sad story. Now, how long did you train recruits at Paris Island?
About a year.
And where'd you go next?
We went from Paris Island up to Cherry Point to the rifle range up there, which was between the runways, which was the Naval Air Station.
And you were going to train pilots there, is that correct?
We were training officers who were pilots in training at that time, yes.
And who was in charge of this training?
There was a chief warrant officer named Sightsinger, who himself was one of the old-time Marines. I always remember one thing about him. His face was very flush. He used to drink a little bit, which was a habit of the Marines, especially the old-timers.
And he arranged competition on Sundays?
On Sundays, he would bring out some of the officers that we had worked with all during the week, and they would challenge us to a match on the range, and they never did beat us.
Now, you also mentioned off camera that there were several tragic plane crashes at
Oh,
this
yes.
time. Is that correct?
As I said before, we were the rifle range was situated between two of the runways that were there at the air station. And I remember one occasion when there was a B-26. I forget what they used to call that, but it was not what you'd call a safe airplane. It had a bad reputation.
Marauder, was it?
I think it was a B-26 Marauder. And anyway, the plane took off and settled onto the runway, and all of the personnel on board were killed. And we had heard later that the reason this happened was because the pilot who was flying that particular B-26 had been flying fighter planes. And he was in the habit of, once they gained a certain airspeed, they would lift their wheels and the plane would settle, but they'd take off. Well, in this case, he did that, the same thing as he'd do with a fighter, but it didn't lift off fast enough and hit the runway. Then we saw another case in which two fighter planes collided, and one went into the swamp, and the other one came back onto the airstrip, and I think he survived. The other fellow didn't. But I also comes to my mind that in that particular area was a fellow named John Keller, who was from a prominent family in Pittsfield. He played football for Holy Cross, and I remember seeing him on the Pathé News at the Capitol Theater in 1942 or 41, in which he was playing football for Holy Cross, and he was a lieutenant in that area at that time. I didn't know it at the time, but found out later when we met at Riley's in Pittsfield while we were both in the service.
Now, there were all types of planes here at Cherry Point, right?
Yes, there were. And in fact, they had the F-4U, which was a Corsair, and the F-6F. And then they had other dive bombers, and they had, I remember one time they brought in a twin-engine plane from England, which was made out of plywood. And they put it up against our planes, and it outflew our planes with one motor going. It was a twin engine, but it was a tremendously fast and versatile plane.
Now, these pilots were the same ones you were training, right?
Yes,
on the range.
yes.
So that had to hit home when there were accidents.
Oh, yes, yes. Of course, we never knew many of them personally, other than the very brief period. We couldn't tell whether any particular pilot who got killed had been on our under our instruction or
Right.
what have you, but we assumed all of it was the same.
Now, you mentioned there were some combat veterans from Guadalcanal that were there? In a casual company?
At Cherry Point, we were stationed with the MPs, or the guards, and in that group were some of the veterans who came off of Guadalcanal, who had malaria or other wounds from which they had recovered. And it was interesting talking to them.
I imagine.
Yeah.
Now, you told me a couple of stories, too, that you met a couple other guys from Pittsfield while you were there, about a Peter tube on an airplane.
Oh, yes. There was a fellow from Pittsfield that I met at Cherry Point who was assigned to the section of the air wing, which was the Marines. And he said, geez, Clem, he said, I almost killed my pilot today. I said, what do you mean, Mike? He said, there's a tube on the end of the airplane wing that gives the pilot an indication of what his airspeed is. And there's a cover that comes with it, and Mikey forgot to take the cover off. And the pilot was mad as hell at him, but fortunately it didn't hurt him. Then there was another fellow from Pittsfield that I had gone to St. Joe with, named Eddie Guinan. Although he was somewhat slight in physical aspects, he was a great little football player. And he was in the Coast Guard, stationed at Cherry Point. And he told me how he was taken out to the ocean one day and had to jump into the ocean to pull a couple of guys out of a downed plane or what have you, and was somewhat of a hero. I think those were the only two. No, there was another fella, Bill Hanford, was from Pittsfield, and I met him there. He was in the machine shop at the air station, and he married Buddy Gilmartin's sister, who for a long time was the worked as the head lady at the FMTA in Pittsfield on Melville Street.
Okay. And how long were you stationed at Cherry Point?
I'm going to say that it was probably close to a year. It might have been 6 months. I'm not positive of that.
Well, what was your next duty station?
From Cherry Point, they moved us over to Camp Lejeune, to the tent camp, preparatory to going overseas. And from there, they moved us to Camp Pendleton, where we were situated at the time the Marines landed on Iwo Jima. And things went very badly at Iwo Jima initially, so they came to us and told us, get ready, you're going to Iwo Jima. Well, fortunately, things changed on Iwo Jima, so they said cancel that. So we went back to continue training at Camp Pendleton, and eventually we went to from Camp Pendleton to San Diego, where we shipped over to the island of Maui in the Hawaiian Islands, preparatory to joining the 4th Marine Division.
And they had received heavy casualties on Iwo, is that correct?
Oh, it was terrible. When we joined the 4th Division, the first company I was sent to as a replacement, I don't think there were 10 men in the whole company. The rest of them had either been killed or wounded, and were in the hospital. Then they moved me into another company, which eventually was the one I stayed with, Company I in the 4th, in the 24th Regiment. And there were some that were absent there as well, but it was more, there were more people there who had survived Iwo Jima.
Now, how long were you here? You said about 7 months. Can you describe some of your training on maneuvers and so forth?
Well, we would go out from, we lived in tents on Maui, and the whole side of a dormant volcano was our base. And when we would go out on maneuvers, we'd take our pup tents with us and go out into the field, and we would train maneuvers, which are typical of infantry. And I remember we had one fellow who was a native there of the Hawaiian Islands, and he came to us and told us that while you're in the jungle, if you're stranded, macadamia nuts are available, along with a lot of other things that he told us about that we could use as a source of supply of food. We trained with mortars and artillery and field pieces of relatively small caliber. And we had a fellow named Captain Ketchum, who was a lawyer from Yale, was a great fellow. He's from New York City, and a very good man.
And this was day and night training, too.
Oh, yes. We'd go out in the daytime, and you might do the whole thing for 4, 5, 6 hours, and then you might come back and have your meal, and get a call to go out during the night. You have night maneuvers as well.
And also, weren't you assigned to sort out some equipment that was returned from Iwo?
Yes, this particular incident took place before we actually joined the 4th Division. But while we're waiting to be assigned to the 4th Division, they took us up to this big warehouse where they had salvaged material from Iwo Jima, rifles, clothing, boots, knapsacks, bayonets, any number of equipment that the infantry would be inclined or required to use. And they had us picking out and sorting out all of this material that had come from Iwo, and I was very impressed with a lot of that stuff because a lot of it showed evidence of being burned. Now, whether it was from our side or from the other side, I don't know. But it created the impression in you that Iwo Jima must have been one hell of a place to be.
Right. Or one heck of a place not to be.
Right.
Were you on Maui when the war ended?
Yes. And when the war ended, I'll always remember it was like a wave that started someplace in the division. The division's about 20,000 men, if you can picture it. And we're on the side of this volcano in tents, and all of a sudden you hear this buzz, and then it becomes a roar. The men had learned that Japan had quit, and everybody was excited. Some guns went off. There was hooting and hollering and everything else. We had a great time.
Had a party.
Yeah.
You also mentioned you had a story about the Kailua Naval Air Station. There was a sergeant there, had a little business going.
Oh yes, when we first came into Maui, it was in the town of Kailua, and we were in these prefab, I'm going to call them shacks because they weren't much bigger than shacks. And I forget how many men we had at that particular time as replacements, but there were 2 experienced buck sergeants, and they got us all together and they said, gentlemen, our water supply has been contaminated. It's up on one of the hills, and they found a dead body in there, so we can't use the water. But fortunately, we've been able to solve the problem. They had gone out and purchased pineapple juice, Dole pineapple juice by the cases, and they sold it to us for $0.25. They were making a buck. But that was, again, the Marines.
Right. Where did you go after Maui? Where did they send you?
To the island of Okinawa, which is just south of Japan.
And there was something unusual about your landing day, right?
It was my birthday.
And what was your assignment there?
We had gone in as replacements for the Navy personnel who were there ahead of us. That was my experience. What the rest of the Marines did, I think, was more the military police in the whole area where they happened to be assigned. When I was on Maui, on Okinawa, this Lieutenant Driscoll, who had been a former enlisted man in the Marines, but one of the big, I think he got his commission on Iwo Jima. He picked me to go with him up to a place called Januza. And up there was a Navy commander, Ferber, and a Navy chief, Mason, I think the fellow's name was. And Officer Lieutenant Driscoll and I were going to replace those 2, working with the civilian police, organizing them, supplying whatever they needed if we could out of our supplies. And we were simply an extension of the military government on Okinawa that had gone from the Navy to the Marines. And we worked with the, as I say, the civilian people. This included the oversight of the distribution of food supplies that the Americans gave to the Okinawan citizens, to see that it was not stolen or misused. Also to work with the local police in helping them control the civilian population. And for instance, the civilian police had no communication like telephones and what have you, but somehow they would get the information about people. And I remember one incident where the civilian police chief, his name was Nishihara, who was a Tokyo University graduate, came to us and said that they had a prisoner located somewhat south of where we were, and he wondered if we would go with them, a couple of the civilian police, to pick this man up. And we agreed to do so, and we went down, and they took us directly to the tent where this fellow was located, picked him up and brought him back.
They knew the exact location.
They knew the exact location. There wasn't much they missed. But I noticed also on Okinawa, you'd never see a horse or a dog. I think I saw one horse during that whole experience over there. But, well, anyway, I don't want to get it.
Well, that's for food, right?
Yes, the Okinawans used them for food. They were devastated. They had a lot of casualties. It was a horrific battle between the Japanese that were there on the island and the Marines and the Army.
Right. Now, you mentioned also that there were still Jap military holdouts in the area, in the hills, right?
Yes, part of the operation that we had in conjunction with the military government, there was U.S. military government that was there. There was a large stockade surrounded with barbed wire that held Japanese prisoners who were prisoners from the war that had just ended. And the U.S. military would connect with some of those prisoners who would cooperate and go out into the hills in Okinawa and talk in some of the holdout prisoners of war, or prisoners. I'm sorry, I'm calling them prisoners before they become prisoners. Right. The holdout soldiers who were on Okinawa. We had nothing to do with that particular operation, but we observed them. One thing we noticed about these operations, whenever some of the Japanese prisoners were working with the U.S. military in doing this of talking prisoners in, whenever a Japanese soldier as a prisoner, as a holdout would come in, instantly the Japanese or Okinawan women, you could see them respond like they were Hollywood stars. Heroes. So you knew that you had a Japanese prisoner or a Japanese soldier in your presence.
Amazing. Now, you mentioned the landmine incident, too.
Yes. Part of the duties that we had over there were to keep the civilian population confined to certain so-called safe areas because many of the other areas that were unsafe had been mined by the Japanese military, and consequently they tried to keep these people away from those areas. However, a lot of the Japanese, the Okinawan people, civilians, wanted to get back into where they came from in that section of the island. And without realizing it, they would go into these areas where the mines were, and they'd get killed or badly wounded. And I remember one incident in which I think it was a young lad got badly injured so that his leg was very, very badly injured. And behind our quarters where we operated was a Japanese or Okinawan hospital. And I went over there as part of the movement of this boy into the hospital. And over there, a Japanese doctor put him on like what I called an ironing board. It wasn't any more stable, and proceeded to saw his leg off. And I was very, very shocked and impressed with that experience. Although it was primitive, it was the best they had at the time. And of course, it wasn't up to the U.S. military to do anything. It was a civilian thing. I also observed while there at that particular period of time, there were a lot of people who had leprosy that were rounded up by the civilian population or police. They were put into a field tent and held in that place until they could move them out to an island where they had a leprosarium. That impressed me as much as anything else. And I also learned at that time that leprosy is not very contagious, although the fear was there. Yeah. You have to have the right kind of conditions to contract leprosy, and that had to be filthy, long-term, filthy conditions that might present the ideal site for an infection.
And they had just gone through that type.
Yes, and there was total destruction there of everything of the economy.
Now you mentioned that there were also some Japanese American soldiers there. Japanese Americans.
They called them Nisi. And what they were a lot of Japanese Americans from Hawaii and those islands who were, I think, all volunteers into the U.S. Army. And their duties were to come to places like Iwo Jima or Okinawa and be able to converse with the Okinawans or the Japanese, because they all spoke Japanese. And these Japanese American soldier Nisis would be the communication between the American military and the Japanese soldiers, Japanese civilians, the Okinawan civilians. And they performed a great service. There was one fellow, a fellow named Okamura, he and I became very, very good friends. And I never responded to a letter from him before I left Okinawa, so I lost contact with him.
I didn't ask you this before, but how did the Okinawans treat the Japanese American soldiers?
I could not see any distinction between the Okinawan civilians and the American Nisi. They could communicate with each other because they had a common language. I would say they got along well. The Japanese, the Okinawans, had taken a terrible beating on Okinawa. So I don't think they were in any mood or had any inclination to either condemn or ostracize these people from the Hawaiian Islands.
Right.
They were just a beaten nation, and everybody seemed to get along okay.
And you mentioned the Navajo code talker.
Oh, and that was in the 4th Division. We had one of those Navajo code talkers. He was a big Indian. He never said anything. He'd smile when somebody would call him something, chief or something. And but he was in our group, and from what I've read about those gentlemen, they performed a great service.
Can you tell us what they did?
Well, they could communicate between themselves so that no Japanese or anyone else could understand them. So the result was that you had great communication that was safe from being intercepted. They played a very vital role in the military.
Now, how long was your stay on Okinawa?
Let's see, I think I got there in November, and I left, I think, in April.
And
So it'd be about 6 months.
Did you return to the States at this time?
I did.
And where did you land?
we came to San Diego, and we spent maybe a week there being processed about being sent back to where we came from. And we came back to Bainbridge, Maryland, and that's where we were discharged.
Yeah.
I always remember at Bainbridge, Maryland, just before we actually left the Marine Corps, again, one of the old-time Marines came to us as a group and said, now I want to tell you guys something. You're about to be discharged. If you've got any kind of material, weapons, hand grenades, unexpended shells, pistols, revolvers, or machine guns, or anything else, take and get rid of them now, because if you don't and you're caught with them, he said, you're not going home. So you had a choice. Do I take this old 45 or do I leave it? And you could see a lot of stuff dropped. That's
Right.
where they left it.
You included?
I included.
So then you were discharged from Bainbridge?
Yes.
And you mentioned before it was May 12th of 46.
Yes,
Do you have memories of that day?
I do. The first thing we did when we left the Bainbridge, we went to a little restaurant and we ordered ham and eggs, or bacon and eggs, and we had a real good breakfast. First civilian meal we had in 3 years, more or less.
Right. And then you took the train, you said, to New York?
We took the train from there to New York City, where we put up in a hotel and decided we'd have a night off. And when we checked into the hotel, we all had some money with us because we had received money as we left Bainbridge. And somebody said we ought to put all of our pocketbooks and money and other things that we wanted to keep into a basket or something that would go into the hotel vault. And we did this. So then we went out on the town and had a great time. The next morning, about 7 or 8 o'clock, the phone rang in the hotel room, and this fella from Tarrytown, New York, whom I had met in our night off, it was a good guy. He said, Clem, he said, guess what? I said, what is that? Whatever his name was. He said, I took all of our wallets. He said, I got everything up here in Tarrytown. I said, oh, geez. I said, what do we do now? He said, I'll send it all to you guys, everybody. And we got everything. As far as I'm concerned, got everything. But again, typical of the Marines. They looked out for each other.
Sure. And from after your little stay in New York, you came back to Pittsfield?
Yes.
And how did that feel?
Great, great. It was good to get back.
Now, when you got back, did you go back to school or did you go to work?
Well, when I came back, I think I went on, started working for construction. And I worked for a fellow named E.J. Kramer, who was a great contractor in Pittsfield, along with Gil Bain, which was out of Providence, Rhode Island. They built a lot of buildings in the GE. And there was a fellow, the Olson family, Billy Weller, were all superintendents or co-workers at the different places I worked. Charlie Martin was another great guy. And eventually, my oldest brother, who was in the Air Force, and he had been out before I was, he had been, was able to get into Boston College. He wanted me to get a tryout at Boston College. So he had me try out for the football team, which I did. And I met a fellow down there named Marty Conley, who also was trying out. And they told me I could come in the following September. In the meantime, there was a fellow named George Strizzy from Pittsfield, a lifelong friend of mine. He said, I just got in up at St. Michael's in Winooski Park, Vermont. He said, why don't we take a ride up? He says, you can get in for $5. So I said, okay, because we were footloose. So we went up to St. Michael's, and there was, I think, a Father Albeezer. He said, you want to come here? I said, yeah, it sounds good. He said, all right, give me $5 and I'll register you, which I did. Eventually, it was St. Michael's was right next to Fort Ethan Allen, which was an old Army base. Eventually, the government moved all of the barracks from Fort Ethan Allen to St. Michael's, and from that time on, it started to grow. What else was there?
Did you graduate from?
I did. I
St.
graduated from St. Michael's in 1950, and then I went into Boston College Law School.
Did you get a degree from St. Michael's?
Yes, I did. A BA in English.
Now, you said you went into BC after this. Did you take
Yes, I
advantage
did.
of the GI Bill?
Yes, I did. I was still on the GI Bill, and I almost got through all the way through BC. But the money I earned in the summertime put me through.
And do you remember when you went to BC?
1950.
And,
1950.
And when did you graduate?
In 1953.
And what sort of degree did you earn at BC?
An LLB, which is a law degree.
Now, did you return to Pittsfield to practice law?
I did.
And who did you practice law with on your first?
There was a fellow named Judge Harold Goey. He was a well-known football referee in Pittsfield, a great guy, and he used to be the judge up in the Adams District Court. And he was kind enough to give me space in his office where I spent, I think, about maybe a year.
And where was that located?
In 74 North Street in Pittsfield.
Now, did you practice civil and criminal law?
Yes, I did.
Now, in 1955, you made another move.
I went up to Eddie McLaughlin's, and I shared office space with him. We were not partners or anything. We simply shared office space. I had my business, and he had his.
And in 58, you made another move.
I believe that was when I was appointed an assistant.
No, you shared office space again with some other people?
Jim Scolari? Okay. Yeah, okay. In 1958, it was Jim Scolari, and I joined, again, simply sharing office space. And L. George Reeder was another one of the people that shared the office space there.
And he went on to become clerk of the courts?
Yes, he did. He should have been a Superior Court judge or higher. He was a brilliant guy, brilliant fellow, brilliant lawyer.
Now, in 1960, your direction changed. You received an appointment
As an assistant district attorney, which meant that I couldn't take any more criminal business because I was prosecuting criminal cases, but I could still handle civil cases.
and you stayed there how long, Clement?
3 years.
And then what happened?
Then I became a district court judge by appointment from Chubb Peabody, who was governor of Massachusetts at the time.
And this was as a special justice?
Yes, it replaced Fred Myers, who was a well-known, very experienced and an excellent lawyer. And I did so at the urging of Dan England, who was very high in the Democratic circles, and Bruce Crane, who was very high in the Republican circles. And Bruce Crane had been a governor's counselor previous to this. And when I became a judge, I had to go to a interview at the governor's council, and Bruce Crane went down, unknown to me, to that meeting. And I was told by a fellow named Sullivan, who used to be the governor's counsel, that Bruce Crane, a former colleague of theirs, had come from Dalton for the specific purpose of getting me approved by the governor. And at that particular time, there was a fellow named Bellotti, who was the lieutenant governor under Peabody. And Bellotti was chairman of that particular meeting. And he said to me, Clem, he said, he was a couple of years ahead of me in law school. He said, would you like to be sworn in? I said, why not? And he swore me in right there.
Great.
That day. And my mother and father had come with me to Boston. And I told them on this trip that I thought I was going to simply go for an interview. I didn't anticipate anything. And so when I left that meeting, I was a judge, and I walked down the hill. My folks were waiting for me, and my mother was, of course, and my father were very pleased.
Oh, you must have been proud.
And I always remember when we came home, we stopped at a restaurant to eat. And the first thing my mother said to the waitress was, do you know my son is a judge?
Great story. What year was that, Clem?
That was in 1953. Well, let me think a minute. Let me see. No, that was in 53. That's when I became a lawyer. That would be 1960, I think.
63, maybe.
63, okay. Yeah, yes, 63. That was
talked earlier.
Right.
Can you tell us what's the difference between a special justice and a full-time judge?
Well, at that particular time, a full-time judge could not practice any law. He simply sat on whatever was sent to him, criminal or civil cases, whereas a special judge was only in the district court, and he could not take criminal cases because that's what he primarily sat on, although on occasion he could do civil work as well. But a special judge was generally not assigned to a particular court in the sense of doing daily duty. But he was called upon to go to any place where district court business had to be conducted to fill in for a judge who either was incapacitated or for some reason couldn't be there. And I've gone to Cape Cod, I've gone to Clinton, Mass., Greenfield, Springfield, Northampton, North Adams, Williamstown, wherever you were needed.
And when did you become a full-time judge?
In 1979, I believe it was, the legislature passed a law, although my appointment was for life. At that time, the legislature passed a law that said you can either continue to be a judge, but you cannot continue to be a special justice.
I see.
You had to make your choice. And the reason for that was they had a Superior Court judge in Boston who was in his 90s. And he was still sitting, and he was doing things as a judge that weren't good for the system. So the legislature was moved to take away the status that we had been given of being a lifetime appointment. So from 1979 until I retired, I think in 1990, I was a full-time judge.
I see.
And I could do nothing except full-time work.
And you finished out your career in Pittsfield?
Yes.
Now, at some point, did you marry and have a family?
I did. I married a girl named Mary Malloy, and she was a school teacher. She had gone to the Elms, Our Lady of the Elms. She had a master's degree in education. We had 5 children, 3 girls and 2 boys.
Now, after your time in the service, did you join any veterans organizations?
I did. I joined the American Legion, of which I'm still a member, plus the Veterans of Foreign Wars.
Now, did you keep in touch with any buddies or attend any reunions?
I've never gone to a reunion because the 4th Division was disbanded at the end of World War II. But I met a fellow named Bob Moberg at Paris Island, and we became lifelong friends. I have visited him with my family in Hampton, Virginia on a couple of occasions, and he and his wife have come here to Pittsfield. He called me about a week ago and told me that his wife Shirley had just died. So he himself had hoped that now that Shirley had passed on, that he'd be able to visit some of his friends. So I think he may come here again this summer.
That would be great.
He himself became a preacher, and but a wonderful man, great guy.
Okay, Clem, we're kind of winding down now, but I do have one last question. And do you feel that your time in the service had a negative or a positive effect on the rest of your life?
I would say it was definitely positive. And the reason that I say it, there's a multiplicity of reasons. But they gave you a training, a discipline, a respect for authority, a spirit of unity with your fellow man. It was just a wonderful experience in the sense that you're taken from a little town like Pittsfield and you're sent throughout the world.
Right.
And you meet all kinds of people, all kinds of situations, but you always had the Marines behind you. It was a great outfit. I have the greatest respect for the Marines. I'm appreciative of what they've done for me and the discipline they gave me. And I have nothing bad to say about them. In my opinion, they're a great outfit.
Well, I want to thank you for coming here this morning, sharing your story with us, and even more so, I want to thank you for your service to your country. Thank you, Clem.
Thank you, Rick.